Hi, and welcome to the McGregor Dementia Support Ministry Podcast, a podcast providing relevant resources to those currently walking the dementia journey with their loved ones. And today's podcast is a session that was recorded from our Alzheimer's and Dementia Seminar held here at McGregor Baptist Church on February 22nd, 2025. Today's podcast, 8 Central Needs of Dementia Care Partners by Dr. Edward Shaw.
I thought maybe we'd start with something a little humorous before we get into more serious things. So every time I come to Florida, this Florida driving situation is very different than North Carolina. And I wanted to just make 3 observations for you. This wasn't on what I was supposed to talk about, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. Now, in North Carolina, when the light turns yellow, what we do is we move our foot to the brake pedal. But what I've noticed in Florida is that it seems to more lead to, going to the gas pedal. And then the other observation is that that when the light is red, like what we learned in North Carolina, is you're supposed to stop. See, and not try and get through as many of the light, as many extra things as possible. But here's the biggest difference I've noticed. In North Carolina, when you stop at a red light and you're waiting for it to turn green, that period of time isn't that long. Like, sometimes I feel like at lights here, I'm going to have my next birthday before that light turns green again. So, all right. Well, that's enough stories about driving. I'm going to talk about the 8 central needs of dementia care partners. And so when I was noodling about the book, the Dementia Care Partners Workbook, the purple book that's out there, I thought about, in my experience with caring for Rebecca, and by that time, we had partnered with literally thousands of families in the memory counseling program at Wake Forest. What are the things that caregivers need the most? And so that book is written on the framework of what I call the 8 central needs of dementia care partners. And that's what I want to share with you now. So first, just a few statistics. I said earlier that about 7 million people are living with dementia in the United States right now. For those people, they have care partners. Now, I use the term care partner because early in the journey, that's really who the spouse or the adult child or maybe a friend or whoever, that's who the person is. They're a partner in that person's life and their care. So, for instance, my wife objected to the idea of either the girls or me being called a caregiver because she said, well, why do I need a babysitter? So I use the term caregiver more for when the person is later in the journey and they really, like Cynthia was saying, they need help with those basic activities of daily living. That's when more of the caregiving comes in. But I would encourage you to just think about being a care partner. Make it a partnership in making both of your lives as good as they can be. So the average person with dementia will have at least a couple caregivers. So there are now, according to the Alzheimer's Association, some 16 million family care partners in the United States. They provide 18 billion hours of unpaid care a year. So if you do the math, the average caregiver commits about 100 hours in a month. That's 25 hours in a week. That's a 3.5 a week day job for caregiving. It's a lot of time, and most of it goes unpaid. And caregiving can be really difficult. Most people living with dementia will eventually require help with those activities of daily living that I talked about earlier and Cynthia just mentioned. And in fact, about 1/3 of people who have dementia are incontinent. And by the very late stage of the disease, almost all people with dementia are incontinent. So caregiving is a hard job. And where do you fit in? I've met many of you during the break this morning or right before lunchtime, and you know you're on this caregiving journey already. So let's talk about the 8 central needs of Dementia Care Partners. So the first central need is the need to tell and retell your story. So I shared a little bit about my family story. I shared about Claire's journey with her late husband. And when you're on a stressful journey as a caregiver, you have to be able to talk about it. Because caregiving is a very, very isolating experience. And what most of us tend to do when we feel isolated and we're going through difficult times is we stuff it. You know, we kind of put as much weight in our backpack as we can, and we don't talk about it. And, you know, we say in the field of counseling that you have to feel it to heal it. You have to feel it to heal it. And that's what really this central need is about, is you need someone to talk to. It might be a family member, it might be a friend, it might be coming to the caregiver ministry here at McGregor, it might be a professional counselor, it might be a support group, it might be a geriatric care manager like Cynthia. There are so many different options that you have, but you have to have somebody to talk to. And as I'll say later, you have to be intentional about it. You have to make a plan for it. Like, I am going to find out who that person is in my life that I can tell the story, and I'm going to find time to tell them. Because dementia changes over time, right? There is progressive cognitive change and more functional independence. Means your job as caregiver changes over time too. You carry more weight in your backpack, if you will. And that's why you have to retell the story, because the story is constantly changing. And I think that's the value of having things like support groups. So, every chapter in the book has a little quote, and the quote for this particular central need is, "Your story will heal you, and it will heal someone else." So people, when they go to a support group, many people, if you've never been to a support group, you're like, what is this all about? Like, why am I going to go sit and talk about, you know, what's going on with a bunch of people I don't know? But actually, it's the healing value of telling that story, and that your story will benefit someone else. And that's what support groups are all about. The second central need is the need to educate yourself. So you heard that from Dr. Mass this morning, and from Lee, who got up and told her story, was talking about the importance of education. Because the quote for this particular central need is, "Our strongest emotion is fear, especially fear of the unknown." And so, having counseled literally thousands of caregivers, the questions that are most common when I meet with caregivers is, what's next? What's going to happen next? And that's part of why I wrote the Dementia Care Partners Workbook. It describes the stages in there, and it tells you what's going to be next. Because when you know that something may happen, when it happens, it's not quite as scary. Like, it doesn't quite have the same impact when you knew it was coming than if it comes as a complete surprise to you. And so the nature of dementia, these stages from the mild cognitive impairment stage, which is where you have memory loss, but you're functioning pretty normally, through the early, middle, and late stages as you become more functionally dependent, if you understand what you're expecting in that next stage, it makes it a lot easier to deal with. And there are so many rich sources of education that we have now. You have a hallway of resources that are out there, but also you can get on the internet, and there are just lots of good places to find great information. The third central need is the need to adapt to changing relationships. And so, because of the nature of how dementia affects the cognitive functions, the person's personality, and their emotional functioning. In other words, how they express their emotion, but also how they receive their emotion. All of that stuff results in changes in your relationship with that person. And so the other book, the green-covered book, Keeping Love Alive as Memories Fade, the 5 Love Languages in the Alzheimer's Journey, is about how our family was able to keep the love bond with Rebecca alive as she kind of had progressive changes in her cognitive function. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you a story about the worst moment of her 9-year journey with Alzheimer's disease. But as the person changes, so does your relationship. And so sometimes we say in counseling that a person who has good, healthy mental health, they are flexible and adaptable. In other words, as new situations occur, they're flexible and they can adapt to the changes that happen in their life and their environment and their life situation. People who are living with dementia, as things progress over time, they become less flexible and less adaptable. And so it means that you, as the primary care partner or one of the care partners or family members, you begin to carry the weight of the relationship. In fact, in the later stage of the disease, you're carrying the entire weight of the relationship. If the person loses their ability to communicate, to talk, you're doing all the communicating, right? And that adaptation is really, really difficult. And that's a lot of what we talk about in support groups and in individual counseling. So we say, even though the behaviors of that person have changed, the person you know is still in there. And I say that person with dementia never loses the ability to feel loved. They may lose the ability to let you know that they appreciate your love, but they never lose the ability to feel loved. So let's talk about some of the behavioral challenges that occur in people with dementia. So I talked about apathy earlier today, lack of motivation. I talked about lack of insight, impaired judgment, even just denying that there's a problem. There can be changes in emotional expression, as I just referred to. And then in frontotemporal dementia, the person can lose their empathy. There can be changes in mood, depression, irritability, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, even hoarding can occur, and it can be a symptom of dementia. Repetitive questions, what time is dinner? Where are we going? The same question over and over and over again. For the person with dementia, it's a new question, even if they asked it only 1 minute later. So these can be really challenging things. The challenge of lost identity, no longer recognizing the person. That's the story I'm going to tell you in a minute. And then these delusions we talked about. Paranoid delusions that maybe someone's harming them, or the delusion of infidelity. And lastly, just the brakes are off on behavioral disinhibition. It can be rudeness, it can be socially inappropriate comments, crying or laughing spells, binging on potato chips. Of course, who doesn't like to eat a bag of Lay's every once in a while, right? So what's their slogan? You can't stop eating them, right? But I'm going to tell you about the changes in behavior that occur with later stage dementia. And in our journey, they occurred overnight with Rebecca. So I'm going to share what I think is the most painful moment of the 9 years that we were together on this journey. So one morning, Rebecca and I were having coffee. We always had coffee on our back porch, our lanai, I think as you call it here. We just call them back porches up in North Carolina. But I think they carry the same function. So I had brought coffee to her, and I forgot the cream, so I went and got cream and poured cream in her coffee. And you can't really tell from the picture, but she didn't have a gray hair on her head through the whole 9 years of her journey. She had beautiful blonde hair, and the sun was shining. I said, "Sweetie, your hair looks so beautiful this morning." She looked up at me, and she had this blank expression on her face. And she said, "I have no idea who you are." She knew me the night before. We talked about the kids the night before. But something happened in that night, and she lost recognition of me. I had known her 35 years at that point, married most of those years. Our kids were, I think, 24, 26, and 28 at the time. She didn't know she had children. She didn't know she had been to college. She was a graduate-trained speech pathologist. It was gone. As best we could tell, she lost everything from about middle school forward. And her behavior changed dramatically starting on that day. And these are the things we started to see. So what happened is our bond to each other was literally severed. And she started to have agitation. She became physically aggressive. She was paranoid. She would walk around the house saying, I want to go home, I want to go home. And she was a flight risk. She would try and leave the house because the home that we had lived in for years wasn't familiar to her anymore. So as I mentioned, she started leaving home. She would resist care. She became very depressed at times, and she started to have sundowning. Now, I can tell that you are a very empathic group of people. You heard the story of what she said, I don't know you anymore, and you were sad for me. But now, think about it from her perspective. All of a sudden, she's living somewhere, and that place isn't familiar to her. She has this guy who's trying to get her to take her clothes off and either get dressed in the morning or put her pajamas on at night, or worse yet, get her into a shower, right? But she doesn't know me anymore. And so you can imagine that these changes, which really were triggered the middle and late stage of her disease, she lived for about 3 years after this, that those were dramatic changes for her. And it really, the level of caregiving that we needed also changed dramatically. So that leads into the fourth central need, which is the need to grieve your losses. I think that living with a loved one who has dementia and seeing their personhood change so slowly over an average time of 8 to 10 years, that is really a difficult grief journey. And so we talk about different kinds of grief. I'm just going to sort of highlight a couple of them. You have this anticipatory grief, like what does the future hold? When might they not know me anymore? Or even when is the end going to come, right? You're constantly thinking about sort of what's ahead. And then there's this, what I call ambiguous loss. Now, Rebecca, like many people with Alzheimer's disease, she retained her language function all the way through like the later middle part of her disease. So if she and I went out in public, like the photograph that I showed you earlier today, she looked perfectly normal. If somebody asked them, well, how are you doing today? She would say, fine. And here it is, I'm getting her dressed and helping her shower and helping her with her toilet hygiene, right? And they'll say, oh, Rebecca looks great. She must be doing fine. That's ambiguous loss, right? Because that's not the Rebecca that I knew my whole life. But for other people, they didn't really recognize it. And as a care partner, that doesn't feel very good. And then disenfranchised loss. So this has been referred to. There is a certain social stigma that we attach to people who lose their competence, their cognitive function. And so you tend to see as a caregiver, as a care partner, and as the family caring for someone, people start disappearing, right? Your friends are no longer comfortable being with him or her, right? They don't want to go out to the restaurant because she's messy, right? Or she doesn't understand what's on the menu. And all of a sudden, it's a very, very isolating experience. And that's the nature of disenfranchised loss. So one of the hardest things you'll ever do is to grieve the loss of someone who's still alive. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the kinds of losses that care partners experience. I want to come back to Cynthia's talk, actually, when I reference that. So we talk about in the Dementia Care Partners Workbook, we talk about the different categories of loss that occur. So when you think about those caregivers averaging 100 hours a month, family caregivers, they're losing personal time. They're losing the freedom to maybe go exercise. It affects their job. The average family care partner has a 30% reduction in their annual income because they can't work a 40, 50-hour job and be 100 hours a month caring for their loved one. And they lose time just for, having their own joy. There are relationship losses. So I'm just going to use as a couple, a married couple. You have in your marriage relationship, you have your individual identities, right, as husband and wife, but you also have this relationship, this identity as a couple. I call it your twosomeness, right? And so even the biblical notion of the two become one, you do kind of become one. And when one person is affected by dementia, that twosomeness is lost. You don't have that same partner, life partner that you had before. There's losses in intimacy. There's losses in relational intimacy and in sexual intimacy. And it's affected by the dementia. And then just the idea that, the future you thought you would have together, like I thought we would grow old together, right? And we would stay hopefully physically and cognitively intact until just before the end. That whole sort of dream becomes lost. So this is another loss that can happen. And then a loss of peace of mind, right? Because you're constantly worrying. You're constantly worrying about what's next. What crisis am I going to deal with? You have this paradox of, gosh, I need more time to care for him or her, but I also need more me time. And you can't need more time for them and more time for you. There's only so much time in a day. And now I want to come back to, is Cynthia still here? Oh, there she is back there. Yes, I appreciate your talk so much because in Winston-Salem, we have a close partnership in our counseling center with our Senior Care Authority franchisee. And so I really think of you as a navigator. So when you need someone to help you navigate this whole aging thing, businesses like Senior Care Authority do a great job of that. But often what we deal with in the counseling center is, you'll have an older husband or wife, and they'll say, I promised him I'd never put him into one of those homes. Yep. I'd never put you in the old age home. Because you think about what places were like 50 years ago, they weren't very pleasant. But it's not about a promise. It's not about being a good and faithful spouse and honoring a promise. Same thing, it's not about being a good son or a good daughter. It's about, I call it the residential care question. Right? So to me, I never use the phrase, we put him or her in a facility. Facility I call the F word of this industry. The question is, where is the best place for the person to reside? Is it in independent living? Is it in assisted living? Is it in memory care? Because safety trumps everything. The person has to be safe. They have to be cared about, they have to be cared for, they have to get good nutrition, they have to be socially stimulated, there have to be activities. And so if you can't provide that at home, then it's okay to go into a residential care setting, right? And it may free you up to be actually an actual care partner or to be the spouse again without all those other duties that you have to do. So if you can age at home with help, that's wonderful. But if residential care is needed, the person can't walk anymore. So about 9 months before Rebecca lost her life to Alzheimer's disease, she lost the ability to walk. Isn't that her legs didn't work? She literally forgot how to walk. And so she weighed about 150 pounds. Took 2 people to lift her and get her out of bed. And so if you can't bring 2 24/7 caregivers in your home, which in Winston-Salem is $300,000 a year. If you don't have $300,000 a year, then you have to think about a residential care option. So, and then we could spend a whole hour talking about how this impacts the entire family. So the fifth central need is the need to take care of yourself. Caregivers in general do a terrible job of self-care. They're always thinking about serving their loved one with dementia, trying to meet the needs of their family, but they don't do a very good job of taking care of themselves. And what I'll say is that you have to make some time for yourself. I think we heard earlier an instance where the caregiver actually passed away before their loved one with dementia because the stress of caregiving is immense. So self-care is really, really important. And part of that self-care is having someone to talk to, the need to tell and retell your story. So this is a quote by a woman named Anne Lamott. She says, "Everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you." And I say for every person who is actively caregiving that they should have at least 3 or 4 hours, at least one afternoon a week where they're relieved of duty. And maybe even more than that. The next central need is sort of related to the one I just shared, and that is the need to ask for and accept help from others. Now, often the kinds of changes that I described in Rebecca, in that transition from like early to middle stage Alzheimer's disease, agitation, aggression, hallucinations, wandering, sundowning, incontinence, those can be deal breakers for some families. Like those are things that, they don't know how to deal with those challenges or they don't want to deal with those challenges. I sort of call this the fork in the road, is you have to decide, am I going to try and keep my loved one at home and bring some help in, or do we need to think about residential care? And that's when you might engage someone like Cynthia to say, well, help me figure out what are the options and what are the choices we have. So we very liberally refer our counseling clients to geriatric care managers or navigators because they have the advantage of knowing the residential care settings in your community and what are the good ones and what are the not so good ones. And one that's great today, in 6 months, they get bought out by some big corporate entity, and then they're not so great anymore. So they know, because their boots are on the ground with places, and they can be so very helpful. So be smart enough to know when you need help, but brave enough to ask for it. The seventh central need is the need to prepare for what's ahead. So the average life expectancy of somebody with Alzheimer's disease is about 8 to 10 years. With the other forms of dementia, it's similar. For some people it can be shorter than that. For some people it can be much longer than that. But the point is that you have years, not months or days, to prepare as long as you don't wait for the last minute. And unfortunately, my experience is, and I'm going to, if I were to ask the other speakers their experience, that most people wait until the last minute. So what are the kinds of things that are important to prepare for? Well, there's the legal issues. Do you have your affairs in order? And do you have a will or a trust in place? Do you have a durable power of attorney? Do you have a healthcare power of attorney? And so these sort of things need to be planned for. So we refer all of our counseling clients, we refer them to one of our elder law attorneys. We have Britton Swank, who's here. I don't know if she's in the room right now, but she has a table out there. And really, elder law attorneys are so helpful as you can navigate your journey early on. In North Carolina, we have a look-back period for Medicaid of 5 years. So if you can plan your resources, maybe transitioning your home to your adult children before that 5-year period in North Carolina, but you need the resources of Medicaid, you can actually save your home for your family by being proactive and planning that way in advance. So there are legal issues. There are financial issues. So as Cynthia pointed out, care is expensive. So I will tell you that Rebecca lived 9 years with her Alzheimer's disease. Her care was $499,000. So that's average, and that's a lot of money. We had long-term care insurance, and it paid for $300 of that $500,000, but it's very expensive, and you have to financially plan for that. And then lastly, there are the end-of-life issues. So one of the great blessings that my daughters and I had with Rebecca is that when she had her diagnosis, we sat down with her. She had already been told she would have an average life expectancy of 8 to 10 years. She lived 9 years from the date of her diagnosis, right in the middle of that. But we sat down with her and we said, okay, when the end of the journey comes, she's a person of very strong faith. She says, I know where I'm going. I just don't know when I'm going to get there. But she told us what she did and didn't want at the end of her life. So that 10 days before she died, when she lapsed into a coma, she didn't want any hydration. She didn't want to be fed. She just wanted us to be surrounding her until she took her last breath, which we did. But to not have to wonder what she really wanted, to give her care that maybe she didn't want, that's the preparing and planning ahead. So, caution, dates on the calendar are closer than they appear. And I just can't tell you how many families put off the planning ahead part, and all of a sudden something happens. It can be a fall and a broken hip, right? So 8 to 10 years might be average, but if that person falls and breaks a hip, the mortality of a fractured hip in an older person with dementia is about 50%. And of the people who don't die of that broken hip, only half of the remainder will ever walk again. So that's going to have a huge impact. And falling is something that characterizes not just Alzheimer's, but other forms of dementia. And I want to end with just talking about the need to explore existential and spiritual issues. And Dr. Mast will be coming up and offering his amazing perspective on this issue. But most people, when their loved one is diagnosed with dementia, they'll ask the why questions. Why him? Why her? Well, she loves God. How could God allow this to happen? Because she's been faithful her whole life. So if God does exist, but God allowed this, then maybe God is not powerful and sovereign like we thought he was. Or if God is powerful and sovereign, then is he good? Because he allowed this to happen, right? These are hard questions. They're existential and spiritual questions. They're about the existence, right, of a higher power of God. And you naturally will question that. And I think you have to have the space to do that, right? I believe the God that I believe in and love is big enough to handle those questions, That even Jesus, when he knelt in the garden, he said, my God, Jesus on the cross, after he knelt in the garden, knowing that in moments he would be in heaven at the right hand of the Father, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And if he can feel forsaken, being God himself, we can feel that way too. It's okay to feel that way. And so those kind of issues are important to address. And sadly, bad things happen to good people all the time. As Cynthia said, we're all going to get older. We will all end our earthly lives at some point. The only questions are how and when. And so I just encourage you, and as you hear Dr. Mast speak next, to just think about these sort of questions, that our God is big enough to handle them. So just in conclusion, here's a few things you can think about doing. Find someone to tell and retell your story to, whether it's a family member or a professional or a support group. You need a partner on this journey. educate yourself. Buy books, go to websites, go to conferences. Just learn as much as you can. It'll be so much less scary if you do. Learn how to adapt to the changes that are going to occur. If I had to give you one piece of helpful advice is expect the change, because the changes are going to happen. It's not if they're going to happen, it's when they're going to happen. But the journey will change, and you can get help adapting to those changes as they occur. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to feel sad. That's why you have your counseling buddy or partner or friend, family member to talk to about it. It's okay to grieve those losses. Just get what's inside out. Take care of yourself. Make a wellness plan. Kinds of things Dr. Silver showed in her talk. Make a plan for your own personal wellness, because sometimes we ask this question to our care partners: what if something happened to you? What's the game plan? Ask for and accept help. Caregiving is a marathon, not a sprint, and it's a team sport, not an individual event. And so in order for those things to be lived out, you have to ask for help and you have to accept it. Prepare for what's ahead, the legal, financial, and talk about the end-of-life issues. And lastly, feel the freedom to explore the existential and the spiritual issues. So, thank you again for your time. It's been wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. And please subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so, and leave us a review if you found this content to be helpful.